All right, everyone. New headset, so new full review. I've had the Crystal Super here for a bit over a month now, and lots of time to test with it, see some of the community reactions and troubles, so I feel pretty confident in doing a full review here instead of just the first impressions. So we're going to take a deep dive into this headset on my face right now, and its many aspects, from the clarity, FOV, problems, and some fixes for those, alongside some just general things you'll want to know before potentially buying this or not, because there's a lot to talk about here. But before we get into this though, yes, I did pay for my own unit. I have no guidelines or anything from Pimax about what I can or cannot say. I'm going to be talking about the product itself, but also the company behind it, as it somewhat is directly related to some of those yet to be released features and how much you should or should not value those. I will be including that part at the end of the video for those who just don't care about the company itself and are just interested in the hardware, but I really would strongly advise watching it. Now, let's not waste anyone's time and get right into it, huh? We're going to begin with the positives first and then work our way down to the negatives, as the Crystal Super here, it's got quite the spec sheet. Let's start with the biggest point and what I think is one of the most significant reasons you'd even buy a big headset like this in the current day and age: the field of view. FOV-wise, this headset has 127 FOV with a 138 FOV mode coming via software update, which I don't have at this time, and then a much better hardware solution as an entirely different SKU, but we're gonna talk about that more in the company practices section. Believe me. Anyway, FOV was one of the few things I covered in depth in my first impression, so I'll be a bit brief here, but there are some very important clarifications I want to make. So the Super FOVs really is that good, and it's so nice to finally have some wide FOV options that isn't either ancient or costs as much as a decent used car. While the Super here is only most of what a used car costs. Anyway, here are my WIM FOV results. The horizontal is already really impressive. You're getting around 20 or more degrees of FOV versus the majority of relevant headsets on the market right now. But here's the thing. Just focusing on the horizontal is seriously underselling just how stupid wide this actually is. Because let's talk about the vertical FOV for a bit. Vertical FOV is something I feel is deeply slept on, and people just don't talk about it as much. But once you've experienced something like this, it is amazing how much more grounded you feel in the scene. This is especially noticeable as most headsets don't actually have that great vertical FOV, especially on the diagonal axis, and this contributes immensely to that feeling of an overall far higher area of field of view. Case in point, here's a side-by-side of the Super versus my measurements of the Quest 3 using an AMVR gasket, and the Super just destroys it. But this still does not really capture just how massive this FOV feels if you have not tried something like this yourself. On screen right now is the uncropped view of the Quest 3 using the OpenVR capture and OBS for both eyes and kind of blended together, so we have the full view of everything seen. Not bad, right? Well, now here's the Super at the default FOV mode. It should be very, very obvious how much more you see with it. I lined these up as close as I could, but couldn't get the exact same floor height, so vertical isn't quite symmetrical, but this red square about illustrates the approximate area where the Quest 3's FOV fits into the Super. You can see so much more with the Super, and the Quest 3 has a pretty good FOV versus the average headset. For me, the extra FOV makes me feel so much more part of the scene and just present within the game world, since I don't have those black bars in my vision as much. That sense of wearing blinders that I feel with most VR headsets, it kind of starts to go away at this point. It's not entirely gone, and I've used much bigger, which totally takes care of it, but it's still really nice. Now, moving on to the stereo overlap, that is what both eyes see and is a huge contributor of the 3D effect that you get in VR. It's quite nice on the Super, about matching Pimax's claim of 105 with what I got in WIM FOV. This is putting it up there with some of the industry leading numbers, and it's really, really nice to look at. All in all, it's just great Pimax has been correct about their FOV claims now. We can even see that using the HMDQ tool that grabs the physically rendered values of the headset at what it reports to apps to render, and again, this about matches up with the claims. They basically just kind of rounded up a little. This is an extremely welcome change after what happened with the original Crystal and the whole FOV gate thing. As for the overall visual experience of the FOV, I see virtually no distortions across the whole field of view, but there might be a tiny tiny amount at the very top of my FOV that's really only noticeable when I directly look up there and slowly moving my head up and down. I see most people do get less than me though, kind of in the 100 to 110-ish range, so most people probably won't see that. If I really rapidly swing my head back and forth like I'm doing right now and look so stupid doing, I can see maybe a tiny little bit of it, but it's such a small thing I almost feel like I'm nitpicking even bringing it up. But one reason the FOV is so nice is the lenses. So let's talk about that and the general sharpness. So the lenses on these are good. They are really, really good. To where I kind of wonder if Pimax has either just gotten a lot better and more experience with this type of lens, or just how much the original crystal was being held back by being shoved into a chassis it was not originally meant for with the 12K, and then the lack of fixed lenses on it. But anyway, point is, these are great. The edge-to-edge clarity is simply fantastic. I can look literally over almost the whole FOV with no degradation on the image, except maybe the absolute furthest edges, and even stuff like reading small white on black text at the far edges here, like say my script right now. It's quite doable without being in the center of my vision. On the original crystal, I couldn't really do that very much. One reason I think this is the case is because of how VR lenses work. The pixels per degree, or PPD for short, it's not uniform across the image. You have the clarity mostly concentrated towards the center, and then there is a fall off as you go towards the edges of the vision. Companies like Vario and Big Screen have both done little graphs here, but let's focus on Vario's as the example since it's a lot better. You have the peak fidelity in a pretty small area of the lens, and it falls off more gradually. This module of the Super has a peak fidelity of 50 ppd versus the 35 of things like the Aero and the Crystal. Well, I cannot say exactly how Pimax's fall off is, as they haven't published a chart. Given it's got a much higher base PPD, the peripheral PPD remains just extremely high. And I would say the lens design absolutely does keep up in this aspect, since it wouldn't matter if the optics were the bottleneck and the image was just so blurry. And speaking of PPD, this thing is sharp. Really sharp. At the full resolution, which is admittedly quite scary, but we're going to talk about that in the performance section. This thing is incredibly crisp and I think blows the original Crystal completely out of the water, even with super sampling at similar resolution. I have a Neo G9 monitor, which is basically two 32-inch 4K monitors glued together, and while that is sharper, the center clarity of the Super gets closer to 4K than anything I've ever seen. In the raw clarity and sharpness, you absolutely could replace a 1440p, maybe even a 4K monitor with this alright. I don't recommend doing that though, because it's an incredibly stupid idea for many, many reasons, but the crispness is at least there. Please don't replace your monitor with a VR headset. Even when I were in the original Crystal to similar resolution, the Super is a step up, which is impressive considering how much wider the FOV is. I wanted to use Test HMD to check the clarity, but it's kind of not a really good measure anymore since it only goes back 5 meters and I can read everything on the chart. So I went to a world called the VR Vision Test Lab in VR chat that a person in my comments recommended. Without AA and at the full resolution, could read just absolutely barely line 36 from 10 meters away. But if you do this test, I very strongly advise changing your avatar height so the line you want to read is right in the center of your vision. As the lines get so low, you gotta kind of tilt your head down to read some of them, and as a tall person, that did actually affect my readability enough to where I couldn't fully read 36 at my normal height. Doing the same thing, I was able to read the smallest line, 44, from about 4 meters away. Point is, though, that the clarity is really, really high. In fact, I'd say that almost every time the game assets themselves are more the limiting factor and not the headset. Lots of PC VR games just weren't really designed with this kind of fidelity in mind. Hell, even flat to VR stuff, while faring better of course, doesn't always hold up because you can view all those little imperfections right against your face like this instead of viewing them from a distance like say over here. Now, that said, it doesn't mean you don't still benefit from the clarity, though. We are sort of in diminishing returns, and I said this about going higher than the OG Crystal, but I do think I was kind of wrong about how bad it would be. It's kind of like going back and playing some of the older, but not significantly so, games, such as, say, an early 2010s Call of Duty game. You play that 1080p, it's fine for the era, but come back and play it at 4K, even if it's just an older game, even if you're not going to appreciate it as much as, say, with a modern release, and things just in general look so much more crisp and good in general. Even if the assets don't fully keep up, it is still a decently better experience. That is sort of how I view the decent chunk of the games when using the Super here. Anyway, point is, overall, I do really love these lenses. I think they're better on edge-to-edge clarity than the Quest 3, considering the much larger FOV, but I also don't like those lenses very much. I personally much prefer aspheric lenses. No, that's probably an unpopular opinion, so do keep that in mind if your tastes differ. Now then, moving on to the sweet spot about this, which I define as how easy it is to get into the position for optimal clarity. It's a good bit better than the original Crystal 2, which was just so tiny, and even being from just a little bit off could cause some quite notable issues. Stuff like CA and distortions can get a bit worse, but at least for my face shape, it's still not bad outside, like, say, maybe the furthest edges, even when moving an extra 2 to 3 millimeters off, which I could not say before on the original Crystal. And speaking of chromatic aberration, there is a bit of talk about here concerning that. If you're unaware what CA is, it's where you get color separation like this, and that can lead to getting kind of a colored shadow on certain things depending on how bad it is, and that can just lead to blurred visuals. This kind of visual artifact seems like one of the main weaknesses of aspheric lenses, like in the way that internal reflections and glare are a problem with pancake lenses. And the Super is no exception. In the majority of scenes, I notice almost none save the furthest edges. It's just one of the cleanest images I have seen in the normal gameplay. The CA just is basically invisible to me. However, there are a few cases where it is bad. Really bad. And I'd say worse than the original Crystal even. This seems like it is mostly manifesting in menus and UIs, but it's not even consistent within the scene there. One of the worst examples I saw, and a free one if anyone wants to try it, was DCS about to start a custom mission. See the text in the center area here? Even the blue text there had almost no CA to speak of, no matter where it was in my vision. But the text at the bottom, which have their own boxes, unless it was near the center of my vision, the CA was horrendous on there. Almost double vision and worse than anything I ever saw in the original Crystal. Because this is mostly menu navigation and not all menus are this bad, for example, like VR Chat's UI is perfectly fine for me. I think it's tolerable because most people, you're probably not going to be spending a lot of time in those. But point is, there are some worst case scenarios where it gets quite bad. They're rare, but it cropped up enough for me to warrant mentioning. On that note, we're moving on to the screen itself, which I have separated from the lenses part for a good reason. Because now we're going to start getting into the still largely good stuff, but have a few notable asterisks to it. So, firstly, we have the brightness. Pimax has claimed 280 nits of brightness on the Super, which, as far as I know, would make it the brightest consumer headset ever. For context, the majority of headsets nowadays are kind of around in the 90 to 100-ish nit range, with a couple exceptions that go to the 150 and up range. Now, I lack the equipment to test that exactly. However, I do have a lux meter here, which I use to measure 3 headsets on a pure white background in Steam VR Home. Lux are not exactly nits, so don't take that context. This is not confirming or debunking Pimax's claims. I also must note that I had to turn down the sensitivity somewhat on the meter. I'm not 100% sure if they're right in absolute terms, but focusing on the relative difference, since it was all on the same setting there, the Super is leaps ahead of everything else, and you feel that brightness increase. The Crystal's downright dim in comparison, and the Quest 3 feels like somebody just set the slider to the minimum brightness next to it. This was with a pure white background, and because of some issues with how the Crystal handles local dimming, I would say the differences in the real world scenes can actually be even higher than this would imply, but I'm still figuring out my exact testing methodology for this tool before running more tests. VR headsets don't quite have a standard for this, so if anyone has suggestions, I'm open to it. However, with this brightness, there does come a flaw. Mura. Mura is where there is an inconsistency in the uniform brightness of the image. At worst, it can result in an almost film grain-like effect over the image, which the PSVR 2 had very strongly, and it ruined the image and everything. It is nowhere near that bad here. Pimax has put out a guide showing the panels they ship and claims they ship only grade 1 panels. This is something that's sort of going to be panel lottery and also just how sensitive you are to it. But at least for me, I'd say grade 1's right, and the vast majority of the time the Mura is practically a non-issue. Though from some other people, I've heard they're more bothered by it, but I can't tell you if that's either because they just got a much worse unit with Mura than me, or maybe they're just a lot more sensitive to it. Again, panel lottery. But like I said, for me, the vast majority of the time, the Mura is just practically a non-issue. The only time it is so bad that's highly distracting for me, and I hate it, is a pure white background like the brightness test environment I used. But even there, I tried to capture through the lens example, but with my equipment, which I have an S22 Ultra, I just can't capture the Mura. Nothing works with through the lens, even in the absolute worst case scenario. It's invisible for the camera. So sorry, you're just gonna have to rely on my words for this one. But outside of the worst case scenarios, for me, it's just almost invisible. And even in those, it's hard to kind of find. It was something I sort of noticed in my initial impressions, in part because I was actively trying to look for it as I've been warned about it. There is one kind of head movement where it does start to get a lot more noticeable. If I start bouncing my head up and down like this somewhat realistically, then yes, the Mura starts to come up a lot more often in those cases where it is already really bad. It doesn't come up if I don't see it to begin with. And those worst cases are something like, say, a clear blue sky. Then yes, I do start to notice it more. But rapid side-to-side movement like this, it doesn't really do much of anything. I don't know why. That's just how it is. Strange little thing. Overall, Mura is kind of a non-issue. Nearly never see it everywhere I go. If you need a free place to test, there is the VR HMD test room in VR chat as a corner with several solid colors that can be used to test for Mura and see how much it bothers you. Now, moving on to the colors, they're weird. Not for me, no. I think the colors on the Super are just fantastic. That impressive 96% DCI P3 gamut is putting in work. I would say the colors are a little more natural tone than something like the OG Crystal and what you would normally see with OLED, though. Natural colors are something I think I found myself kind of preferring, honestly. But the brightness really makes the colors pop and stand out in a great way. At least in SDR content, I'd say it can compare quite nicely to my high-end Neo G9. Monitor handily wins in HDR content, though, since the Super can't do that. It's not even a comparison. No, what the weird thing to me is the community issue that has cropped up concerning this. See, a number of people have reported that their Super colors feel washed out and white highlights are way overblown. But I can't find any commonality between what could be triggering the issue and the gap in experiences, because I know it's not a universal thing or just having different color preferences, as several people who initially complained about the same issue then later said the problem just corrected itself somehow, and then suddenly everything looked amazing like they expected. And I've also seen one or two people who didn't have it and then said it later appeared. I've tried everything I can think of to replicate the bug, including things that logically shouldn't affect it. Changing drivers, NVIDIA color settings, DisplayPort versions on my monitor even. But I simply can't find a cause and I'm not affected. Something is clearly not working right for some people though, and I can't say how widespread it is. But Pimax has officially acknowledged it and seen enough reports that I feel it's important for me to bring up. So if you browse around for other opinions and reviews of the Super besides me, which I encourage everyone to do, and you see a huge class of opinions about this specific area, this is probably why. Some people are legitimately just having a vastly different experience here. Anyway, stepping aside from brightness to the opposite end of the spectrum, we have local dimming. There's a lot good here, but it's not all great. So OLED screens have per pixel level dimming since everyone is self-emissive. So you can just adjust each individual pixel to be as bright or dim as you need it to be. Normal LCD screens have a single backlight, which lacks such fine control, so you're basically adjusting the whole screen at once, which is a real problem with displaying dark things where you just have bright things on the screen at the same time. This is where local dimming enters as the middle ground, letting you adjust zones of pixels. Going back to the Super here, it has 1,000 zones per eye, which is a huge step up from things like the Quest Pro or the Crystal, which have 500 and 576 respectively. Now, the Super has a hardware solution which, according to Pimax, lets each zone be controlled individually, whereas the original Crystal had 4 zones controlled at once. So I don't know if the Crystal has effectively a little under double or 7 times the control because of this, but it's a lot better here, point is. Mostly. As a comparison, the original Crystal and Light went through 2 different algorithms, one from launch and then one later. The first one tended to have some bad blooming, but it would preserve detail. Whereas the second one massively reduced the blooming. You started to get Black Crush, where you lose detail in particularly dark scenes. That's the one I'm going to be focusing on since it's the relevant one. And that also came about after my prior review, so my thoughts have changed on the local dimming with the Crystal. Now, the notable thing is this does not really happen with the Super, and there's some places where the difference is just astronomical when comparing the highest local dimming setting. Note on these through the lens videos I'm about to show, it was hard to hold the HMD with one hand and record with the other, so don't analyze these too much beside the relative difference on the stars. Anyway, take the star field in the opening menu of the Outer Wilds VR mod. If you set the local dimming to 1.0 on the original Crystal, you literally could not see the stars. On the Super though, halo? Check it out. It is perfect. No significant blooming, no major dimming of the whole image. You can just appreciate the beauty of space. But since the crystal was software based, you could adjust the local dimming intensity. A very popular thing actually was to set lower to eliminate the blooming while sacrificing a bit of contrast. And I actually preferred to do this myself. But unfortunately, my camera had issues trying to capture the difference, and I couldn't really manage it. I set the crystal to about 0.960 to 0.980 if you have it and want to see it yourself. It helps a lot. But as the Super is hardware, you can't do this. For the most part, this isn't a problem. Vast majority of the time, I don't feel like I want to turn the local dimming down, and works wonders, or it is a very minor issue, less offensive than pancake lens glare to me. Emphasis, majority of the time. Local dimming doesn't have the per pixel control OLED has. So in certain situations, you kind of get blooming, which typically manifests like a white glow around the object. If you're coming from most LD solutions or the crystal itself, the Super's haloing is slightly different and a lot more literal. Worst case, on screen right now, and sorry if YouTube compression kills this one, it probably will, you kind of get this little bubble around the object. The green you see around the sign is part of the game and not the local dimming failing. That literal halo is the local dimming artifacting with this through the lens. This is a worst case scenario where it is highly visible and distracting. And I'd say the through the lens actually doesn't capture how bad it can look in motion. I tried a bunch of testing and scenes of various brightness to try and find some consistency and idea of what the Super's local dimming does bad and good, because that was quite easy with the OG crystal, where it was bad when you had numerous small little lights or like one singular light, but it kind of did great with the middle ground and sometimes like a flashlight thing. But I haven't quite had much luck here. Things that local dimming famously does quite bad on, such as again that Starfield's with Outer Wilds, it's just perfect in the Super, and combined with the lack of glare, it's an incredible experience that will stand up to any OLED there. Then you get things like VR chat, where you get one light source it's not doing so hot on. But it's not just like having one light is the problem. As an environment like this in Saints and Sinners, where I have my flashlight in an otherwise almost pitch black hallway, there is no blooming whatsoever with the flashlight on. If I turn it off, I can still make out details in the dark too, and there's maybe a tiny little amount of blooming, but it's pretty subdued and not that awful halo. I like it. And there's also another one. In certain scenes, you can sometimes see a thin little line that's almost like the border of where the local dimming ends in each zone. But again, it's quite subdued, and I find it far less distracting than glare or internal reflections. The problem with local dimming in these situations are most obvious with head movements, almost like it's a little too slow to catch up. As if you keep your head still in those scenes, short of the absolute worst case scenario where it is always there, it kind of just blends into the scene really well in a bad but not worst case. Overall though, the local dimming is really impressive, and again, in SDR content, it's not quite up there with my Neo G9, but it is close most of the time so far. It may not have the fine control OLED has, so again, some scenes definitely falters a bit, but given the almost total lack of glare on the aspheric lenses here, whereas every current OLED solution I know of is using lenses which have glare, that can sometimes help the Super punch above what its on-paper specs would suggest. And I think it's kind of a pick your poison and whatever bothers you the most. I personally am really bothered by internal reflections pancake lenses have. It was absolutely horrendous on the Vision Pro, and even on the Quest 3 it is tolerable at best. So overall I think I prefer the Super since it's more consistent. Gotta remember, we can't divorce the screen from the lens's strengths or weaknesses. And now we're kind of at the more neutral or things with some more notable problems. Let's knock comfort out of the way since it can be quite quick. Comfort is something that is fairly subjective depending on your face shape. Pimax HMDs have historically fit me very, very well. For me, with a big, wide head, Super's quite nice. The top strap goes further back behind my head, so it's better than the OG Crystal there, where I couldn't quite get as far back as I wanted. I'm able to get a nice, pretty snug fit. Stock, the big problem for me is a default facial interface foam. It's kind of scratchy, and it doesn't really last long. I know that from experience with the AKX and the original Crystal. Comfort's fine for its size and sessions around an hour or two, even standing, but if you're going to be doing some marathon standing sessions much longer than that, I would recommend getting a comfort accessory or two. Studioform Creative has a lot of good things for this, and I find the Super is very comfy using a few things from them. Playing for hours just is not an issue with some of the stuff I have on it right now. But in the current day and age, The Super is a sizable headset. It may not be that big compared to some of the prior gens. Here is a tower of headsets I made with a few notable ones. It's pretty close to index size overall, but we're no longer in 2020 anymore, where that's the norm. I think how much Pimax has crammed into here is quite amazing, but headsets are increasingly moving towards smaller and smaller glasses-like form factors, where weight, it's not even a few hundred grams. Even if I can make this extremely comfortable, and weight distribution, up to a point, this is the very important part, up to a point is more important than raw weight. The size and weight of this thing is a legitimate con in the current market that some may find a deal breaker. I know some VR enthusiasts who do insane things like 7, 8, or longer sessions. You're probably going to feel this after such long sessions versus smaller headsets if you are doing room scale things. And, well, we're on to the mixed or kind of negative things now. Starting with software, depending on how you play, this might either be a pretty okay, even nice experience, or you are in for a rough time. Personally, I do like Pimax Play, and in many respects, I think it has matured greatly from where it used to be like a year and a half to 2 years ago. It's got a lot of really great and easily accessible features, both for some normal and power users, but you're definitely going to get the most out of this as a power user since it's just way more easily accessible options than most software do provide you. From software IPD adjustments, changing individual color channels, foveated rendering of 2 types, and even frame rate caps, you can do a lot here, and some of them, namely having native quad use DFR and then OpenVR compatible DFR with VRS, they are legitimate platform advantages over some competitors. I especially like the integrated DFR because that works with quite a decent number of games and can provide a nice little boost, especially with such a high-res HMD. More on that in the performance section. In some respects, I actually prefer it to native Steam VR options right now since some of those things I like to do as a power user are just built into the software. But, there's some huge flaws in it still, especially if you don't use Steam VR. The OpenXR runtime has something wrong with its frame pacing unless you can meet your target refresh rate of your HMD. I talked about it more in depth in my recent performance video, but to give a brief example here, look at the graphs and note on the graphs with FPS and frame intervals. Steam VR and Pimax XR, the unofficial runtime by Mimbushia, have either fairly flat and or consistent graphs here. Pimax's native runtime really does not. It didn't feel good to me inside the headset. Might just be sensitive to this. I don't know. But if you can meet a perfectly locked frame rate, though, it is fine. Go for it. No problems there. But, speaking of locked frame rate, let's talk about smart smoothing, since that's quite relevant. Smart smoothing is Pimax's version of motion smoothing. Because this headset is so high-res, people may actually want to use it. I personally cannot stand it, and I just take the lower natural frame rate, but I know some people, particularly in slower-paced titles, they do want it. Visual quality-wise, though, it ain't great. But keep in mind, I also just kind of hate motion smoothing of almost any kind. I can sort of live with it at 60 to 120. I didn't really like it that much on the PSVR 2, though. But I just can't live with 40 to 90. Maybe with virtual desktops and some slower paced things, since that's probably the best. But Pimax's quality is just not up with virtual desktop, and even then I'm not a fan. So my opinion on the quality is kind of biased, and oh boy. Related to the software, we are getting to the tracking, and we can kind of split this into 2 distinct categories. Controller tracking, mostly good. Everything else, bad. My room's always been great for inside out like this and the Quest. I've got huge shelves built into a whole side of my wall over there. Likely helps with positional tracking, so might be having a better experience with some on the controllers since they're largely pretty good for me. When it comes to one-handed and quick-paced things, like say deflecting something on screen here or responding to and parrying melee attacks, I don't feel like I have to play around the tracking, and it is a great time. With occlusion, like say aiming down the sights in FPS though, things do get a bit worse. But also depends on the gun being used, and it's improved a bit since my initial impressions. To illustrate, here's how my tracking was pre-update when aiming with a sniper. As you can see, there is a metric ton of jitter and it's a horrible time. But on the latest update, while there is still some jitter and not perfect, it's overall way more controlled and usable. But like I said, it can depend on the gun, as when playing with another gun in game mode. Even with iron sights, it didn't feel much in the way of shaking, since this one was held at a little bit different angle. It is really sensitive to that. So overall, after the most recent beta update, I think the tracking is largely pretty great. If still has some room to improve on occlusion, but it's getting there, and I don't think it'll cause too severe an issue outside maybe super long distance sniping. Once we get to the Playspace tracking, though, the good news drops faster than my will to live dealing with it. The Playspace memory and floor height tracking for this headset, complete, utter garbage. You set up your Playspace with a decent process, and it includes a 3D scan of your room, which for a time seems to work rather well, though it did drift a bit over time till eventually the software just loses the plot entirely, and you get things like your floor height being too low, it being too high, or if you are extremely unlucky, you might wake up with your headset from sleep and watch yourself suddenly vanish into the void. And when this happens, I have the headset and controller start shaking and getting jittering like you're seeing on screen right now. Controllers constantly fly away from me with no real ability to fix it short of restarting the HMD by unplugging it and the software. I haven't had this happen often, but a few times is too many already. Now, thank God there exist apps which let you quickly fix this. You can get OVR advanced settings for free from GitHub, even if it is now paid on Steam VR now, link in the description, so that you can help fix the issue without cost, but little extra friction to install it versus getting it on Steam. It just kind of all adds up. You can also get FPS VR on Steam, which allows for much smaller increments, and that's only a few bucks. If I couldn't fix this with one of these programs, this issue would unironically be a deal breaker for me, despite how much I love everything else and can work around the jank. If you're a simmer or only doing seated play, then this doesn't really matter much because you can just press the recenter button in game and you're probably fine. But room scale! No, nah, man, no way. I'm sure Pimax has gotten returns just because of this from people who don't know about or don't want to just bother with third-party software. Pimax, this should be your #1 priority to fix, after the color bug in the software, as it would save so much headache with the headset from people who aren't power users like me, and be nice just not to have to mess with it even for people who are. It takes me 10 seconds at most to fix with FPS VR, but I shouldn't have to do that. And even on a good case, I have to redo the room scale every 2 days because it starts to slightly drift, and some games it just doesn't, those things don't work in fixing it. If you want to use the default tracking and are one of the few people who does not own FPS VR or OVR advanced settings, I'm not politely suggesting you get one of these apps to avoid a bad time. I'm ordering you to do it. But, oh wait! You can't use these without Steam VR! So I guess you are further screwed if you don't want to use that. Tough luck, buddy! Yeah, the software is not the best experience if you're not playing with Steam VR. For simming, it's okay and fine if you're on a completely locked frame rate or use Pimax XR, but I'd probably advise Steam VR over the native OpenXR runtime at the moment. It performs pretty similarly anyway, and Pimax doesn't really have much overhead. I've had videos on that. There is a Lighthouse faceplate coming at a later point. Q3 now is the estimated date for it. That'll let you use base stations if you are already using those, but no locked-in release date other than a vague Q3, and who knows if that's going to get delayed again. I don't like base stations. I sure hate the index controllers, but I would be driven to use them if this issue wasn't so easy to work around for me. Okay, let's get into the elephant in the room. Performance. So I have an in-depth look at this already, which does test the 5090 in a variety of games, mainly some more demanding ones, but I have a bit of a correction to make from that video, as I think I've kind of undersold the 5090 to where, depending on your use case, I'd actually say the 5090 could drive the Super at full res better than the 4090 drove the OG Crystal at its much lower full res. Yes, really. So in some of the most demanding things, like say Sims or flat to VR mods, yeah, my video covers those demanding cases fairly well, and the full resolution on this, which is roughly 6.2 by 6.3K per eye, it's quite intimidating. Expect to downsample the res or use upscaling there. But for normal PC VR games, even some more notable ones, you can do some stupid things with this, especially concerning MSAA. Let me show an example with Saints and Sinners. This is not an exact comparison since I had to dig up old benchmark footage as I no longer have the 4090. That was paired with the 7950 X3D then versus the 5090 and 9950 X3D now. But look at this! The 4090 is running the OG Crystal at 4312 by 5100 per eye with everything max, about 22 million pixels. The 5090 is running at 6240 by 6280 per eye, about 39.2 million pixels, on the same settings. Despite running a 78% higher resolution, the 5090 is outperforming the 4090 by a completely ludicrous degree to where we actually have significant headroom to super sample if we want to. Like, do I really have to say any more with this insanity? And the game has not been updated since I've done these benchmarks, so something has not changed there. There was actually a lot in my library, which I could run at full res at high or even max settings, even discounting stuff like the ultra low end things or quest ports. Because well, I don't think anyone's going to be impressed running super hot on this. Like, here's a list of some of the stuff I tried that's 2020 or later, counting updates, and I think looks decent graphically, which I was able to run on higher max settings, excepting AA, which I did usually turn down, and I had near dropless 90 Hz. Considering my VR library is about 100-something titles, and maybe a quarter of those are either super old or low fidelity, the fact I can run this many games in my library at full res and good settings means running max res is legitimately viable on the 5090. This card is really the gift that keeps on giving in VR. However, though, I am going to be completely fair and say this is the 5090. The high resolution setting on this card to get full fidelity on this is basically a 5090 exclusive, since that card can perform around 40 to 50% better on a bad day than the 4090 at this res. Sometimes over 2x. But if you play normal PC VR games, then yeah, a high res may not be something universal, but it's viable enough to be a relevant factor. But if you are on literally any other card in the planet, you're probably going to be upscaling some heavily or running at medium res, which is definitely a downgrade on the visuals, but it still looks good, somewhat sharper than the OG Crystal despite the larger FOV, likely because of the better lenses, but the overall picture's a decent bit better given stuff like the brightness. You're not wasting your headset if you're running at mostly medium res. Pimax software has built-in dynamic FoV rendering for OpenVR games too. It's not universal support, but overall it's pretty good, and I'd say maybe 50-60% of my OpenVR library supports it. Tends to work more with Unreal Engine versus Unity. Most of the time the gains with it are in the 15 to 30% range, meaningful but not world-changing. You can sometimes have exceptions depending on the GPU though, and the game. Like Half-Life Alyx sees some pretty silly gains super sampling up to over 8K x 8K per eye with the MSA x2 setting. But again, 5090! I consider the minimum to get a decent experience on this at medium res to be around 4070 Ti or so. If you have worse, get a better GPU first. You still benefit from having a physically higher res screen and stuff, like the brightness, but I definitely would recommend you get a high-end GPU first. And now we have the audio, which I can thankfully make quick because it's definitely a weak point. If you saw my old video, then you saw how awful the Crystal Super mic was. As you can hear, this thing is horrid! Well, good news is that Pimax has fixed it to be usable. Let me switch to it right now. So as you can hear, the Super's microphone no longer makes your ears bleed. Is it great? No. Is it awful? Also no. It's just fine and a mid-tier VR mic. I think this will be perfectly acceptable for most people in normal multiplayer use. Wouldn't use it for something like serious content creation though. Moving back to my good audio and the speakers. Well, I'm not an expert on audio stuff, nor do I have good equipment to get data, so I'm not going to talk about anything like the mids, highs, and all that, so I'll keep my impressions brief. Right now here, I have the DMAS speakers on, you can see, which is either a pre-order bonus or a separate $100 add-on. By default, the Super comes with the SMAS. These tiny little things. The sound quality on them is not great. I was much softer on these on the Crystal Lite because, well, that headset was like half the price of this one and more targeted for the mid-range. Compromises are more acceptable there. The same charity is not affordable at a much higher price point. I still do like it's at least a present audio solution, as some higher-end HMDs are foregoing audio entirely, and I hate having to use my own headphones, even with nice things like my Odyssey Maxwell right here. These are somewhere between usable and okay tier. If you're really penny pinching, I guess. Quest 3 audio is just better. Pimax is actively working on audio improvements though, so might change in the future. I hope it does. Until then, I really recommend the DMAS, but I guess you at least have audio without it. Some headsets have really been kind of skimping on audio. Now, as for the DMAS, which I have on, audio's great. Prior to the current update, it was kind of lacking and too quiet, but they did improve that. It's still not quite as loud as the OG Crystal, though. I recommend using this equalizer APO tweak that one of my comments suggested way back. It makes it louder and just a one-click option after install. My DMAS feels very loud now. 10 out of 10 recommended top tier VR audio solution. All right, let's have a quick lightning round on things too small for their own section. The Super has 2 USB-C ports, the bottom here, which is 3.0, while the one at the top right corner, which is USB 2.0. For social VR use, you can use Broken Eye to get extra parameters and do a lot of fun little things with that. We'll have links in the description on how to do that. Broken Eye does have the left and the right eye appearing as to be swapped, but doesn't seem to affect the tracking in any way and works properly. with maybe the exception of convergence, as somebody reported going cross-eyed causes their eyes to spread apart. I haven't been able to replicate it, so I don't know if it's a unit problem or if I just can't go cross-eyed enough. Pimax has also stated they've tried to improve QC, but I'm a little skeptical if it's worked out, because while it's possible shipping damage can occur, I've heard a couple complaints about quality, and I've had to get replacements for my Super's right controller twice in a month. The first because the thumbstick was getting stuck drifting right when I would push that in that direction, and then the second controller because the grip button just would not work properly. And so here I am waiting for another replacement. I'm currently using my Crystal Light's right hand controller as a holdover. So yes, you can also use the Crystal Light controllers with the Super here. That's nice. And now we get to what I've been saving my rants for. Future features and the company behavior. I can divorce a company from the product. However, these two are quite relevant because it can relate to how much faith you should put into Pimax to solve these issues or fulfill other promises about coming features. As there are a number of yet to come which are related to the Super, such as the Lighthouse faceplate and then the additional optical engine modules. Plus fixes they're working on for certain issues like the color bug. And I kind of like this to be somewhat useful, both information on potential buyers, but also an open letter to Pimax. Let's tackle the 50 ppd's wide FOV mode, which is now being touted as 138 horizontal, 140, rounding up, whatever you want to call it. So, going back to the initial announcement of the Crystal Super, the 50 ppd module was listed as only 130 FOV, which is actually in line with the current measurements, again, just rounded up. But then, eventually that rose to 135 degrees with the Pimax Sync event several months ago. Now, keep in mind that every change after this point, Pimax has already taken money for pre-orders. Pre-orders for this were about $1,000 USD. There was the $1 reservation before that, but there's kind of a difference between those two values. Anyway, then, right before launch, they announced the 50 ppd would have two modes. The default mode that everyone has now of a little under 130 with 105 stereo overlap, and then there would be a second mode which would actually exceed the 135 number and go to 138 with 90 overlap. Then, flash forward about 2 months to present day, we get another update on this. Pimax is now releasing another swappable module that is a hardware solution to hit an undistorted 140 FOV. And they directly cite that there are several notable issues with the software-based one, like distortions, because why else would you phrase it like that? Inaccurate eye tracking, and then you have to move the lenses further apart so you're not technically in the perfect sweet spot. So, though Pimax is still going to release this as a feature, that's very important. Keep this in mind. Some people have missed this, or at least apparently they're going to. It sounds like that the wide FOV mode on the 50 ppd with a software solution, this kind of sucks. And they're doing it more so as out of obligation. And then the hardware solution is going to be if you want something actually good. If the wide FOV mode is good, I doubt they'd be doing this. I could be surprised, and maybe it isn't bad. But given the comments and it's taking so long to come out, I'm cynical. Very cynical. And this is a big problem, because I'll bet you that most of the people who bought this module for the Super bought it for that ultra-wide FOV. And things get worse, because I reached out to Pimax for comment about if you would be able to swap your 50 ppd module for a wide FOV one for people who currently have a Super and have one delivered. Because otherwise you're basically punished for buying the product instead of waiting 2 months for an announcement. As if you don't have yours shipped yet, you can still switch to the wide FOV module for free. But concerning people who already have their Super, Pimax could not give me an answer on that one, which I'm not happy about. I'm really not happy about, because now it sounds like the solution to getting what you were originally expecting is pay an extra $400 because you decided to be one of the first buyers. You utter fool. This isn't a product that came out halfway through the HMD's life cycle. I have no complaints if that happened. This came out before pre-orders are even half done shipping. How's that for taking care of pre-orders, huh? I'll reserve some judgment, as angry as I am about this, till I actually get to try the software FOV mode and hope it is decent. But if it's awful, I'm going to have some strong words about it, and I'm not optimistic given how it was described. Editor's note here, because I forgot something at the last minute. When the Crystal Super was originally announced, it had 120 Hz as part of the specifications. Later during the Pimax Sync event, this got downgraded to 100 Hz, but this is also now in lab mode. It is not available presently, so we only have 90 Hz usable right now. And yes, the downgrade from 120 to 100 did happen before they started taking pre-orders, which I think is an important distinction, but it still goes into my broader point about Pimax just announcing things before they figured it out and changing the deal. Again, I could be wrong, and maybe the software-wide FoV mode isn't so bad, but when it comes to future features like this, it's not really that easy to give Pimax the benefit of the doubt, because things either change, they get pushed back immensely, or they get canceled entirely quite often. Anyone remember the wide FoV lenses for the original Crystal? Prototypes for which I made a review on a whole year ago, and only recently did they start going out in highly limited batches, and it wasn't even good? Or how about the 60 GHz Airlink module for the OG Crystal that just recently entered beta testing? The mixed reality faceplate, the 42 PPD lenses. I mean, do I really have to keep going on? Look, VR hardware is hard, and Pimax is far from the only company who has delays. It's kind of a problem in the mid and small level VR space I think a lot of people ignore, but Pimax does consistently have a massive problem with dates and overestimating what they can do, prematurely announcing features or sometimes entire headsets before they properly figured out how to make it work and get people buying into things off it. And so even if they come out with a fantastic headset, it'll always fail to live up to expectations and hype they set for it just by comparison, because they promised the moon. And this has been a consistent pattern over and over again for years at this rate. If you've been here a while, you know that this slide alone could be my whole argument, but I think the point has been made. Even now, things like the Lighthouse faceplate have been pushed back to Q3 of this year, so you just can't really put a lot of stock in Pimax with dates, and it goes to a level which is beyond simple excessive optimism, if you ask me, given this very consistent pattern. And because of that, if you have any interest in Pimax products, particularly the Super, never, ever buy them based on promised features. You should always only buy the headset if you are happy with how it is presently. Those promises of more features should just be treated like a nice bonus and not a significant part of your purchasing decision. If they are, just don't buy it yet and wait. Until you see it in hand with third party, it may as well not exist, because you could be waiting a month or literally years. Pimax, this is how basic human psychology works. This is coming from a psych graduate. It always feels better to get a welcome surprise than for the situation to constantly feel like this.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
Case in point, when originally announced, the Super had the original form factor of the Crystal. Look at how big this thing is compared to the Super. You can see it quite clearly. But then, completely out of nowhere, Pimax announced a huge reduction in size down to what we presently have. And everyone loved that, because it was exceeding expectations and a pleasant surprise. Do more announcements like that, and less like how they are now. And it's really unfortunate I have to make this rant again, because in some ways Pimax seems like they have really been trying to make some significant effort in certain areas, but trust is like a building. It takes months to build it up, but a second for enough explosives to knock it all down. And that effort gets dampened by the current marketing antics with the 50/50 PPD's wide FoV mode. You guys even originally advertised this as 130. That would have been fine. And look, I get somebody's gonna probably already say, they're probably already typing in the comments, oh, people are gonna feel upset if 2 months after a launch, a much better thing came out of nowhere without warning, so it's good they told us this. And yes, people would get upset. But it doesn't mean shit when earlier adopters get punished anyway. So the result is the same. If you'd instead talked about using a second optical engine from the get-go for that extra FOV, it instead seemed like a victory for that design choice, showing just how many crazy things you can do with it when you have modules for or close to actual industry-leading stereo overlap, FOV, and PPD without buying 3 entirely separate headsets, and instead you can just get the cheap optical engine modules. But now the price on those has risen a lot since the original announcements. So it's so expensive anyway, I doubt most people will care about trying them. And those original prices are only for pre-orders who made them when that was the announced price. And I still have to give Pimax some praise for honoring that pre-order price, but that's kind of the bare minimum. It's this really kind of bizarre combination of both FOMO, but also discouraging you to buy early. Like, if you want to just wait and see what the reviews were before putting down $700 on the micro OLED engine, well, tough shit. It's gone up by hundreds of dollars unless you already pre-ordered. And even for new pre-orders, it is well over $300 more expensive. Yet you don't want to pre-order too early since, well, look at the wide FoV engine. Pimax is putting themselves in this with a no-win situation by announcing so much stuff well before they have all the details ironed out, and then they just figure it out afterwards, which leads to these messy situations like this. Or all the effort spent over the last several months trying to improve transparency, customer service, and though it seems like they've gotten a bit overwhelmed by the new launch, it's not entirely unexpected and a little excusable though. And then the warranty policies with some great transparency and in-writing changes. This is the important part, to show action, especially on the warranty, with things like extensions on RMAs near the end of the warranty period and frozen trial periods when problems are reported. I will have a link in the description to check out those statements yourself, and you can know your rights. But then all that goodwill just vanishes into the abyss with the recent controversy revealed by Mav Gaming in a Reddit post. Link will be down in the description, covering all of this with screenshots and everything. The gist of it being that it was an incentive program which was sent to a few people offering rewards for mandated positive reviews. Directly quote said, must be at least 70% positive. Pimax did very quickly reply with a statement in only about 5 hours from when this was originally broken, for the story at least, and then put out a video disavowing what happened and admitting fault shortly after, saying that only 3 people got the full message and no reviews were posted under this offer. They also had some further clarifying statements with Upload VR, also we'll link those. It's good the response was quick. Mistakes do happen and companies should be given the chance to correct their screw-ups without being blacklisted forever. I think what was said in the statement and making plans to change internal policy to avoid this again is good, but the reason that I bring this up, despite the response, is that this is not the first time something like this has happened. And it's why I worry about company culture. See, this incident really pisses me off because years ago, before I seriously did YouTube, I actually called out Pimax for what looked like using fake Reddit accounts for astroturfing. This was so long ago that I can't remember or find all of the accounts. I only have the one most memorable I saw consistently. But I found like 10 accounts in 2020 that all had a post history looking like this, of posting nearly nothing but Pimax deals and reviews without any kind of obvious brand affiliation, while also trying to have normal posts elsewhere that they looked like they were bots. And that alone, that's not proof. Yes. But in that era, I actually called this out on one of their posts for giving contradictory stories no real person would, and they instantly deleted the post while blocking me across multiple of the accounts I suspected of being fake. This was years back and all the posts were deleted, so all I have concerning this is this post in the Pimax community Discord a few years ago where I spoke on it briefly, so I hope I've earned one trust me on this pass. This behavior poisons the well for reviews. It makes them unreliable, and it's just incredibly stupid for the company. As once discovered, it'll have a huge backfire effect, which makes the reliability of them worse for both the consumer and the company. Because I already see people now questioning if any positive sentiment on the Super has been paid for and bought. God's sake, I bet there is already somebody out there who's going to think I'm on Pimax's payroll just because I deeply love the hardware, despite me doing this call out right now. Even if Pimax does respond and acknowledge fault, it still makes me worry about company culture and just how deep-rooted this goes, because this isn't the first incident, and at the moment, time feels like it's just a flat circle with Pimax of they tried to do better for a while, then they stumble back again, and we are back to square one. I could say that this was years ago and people change, but then given the recent incident, that's the reason for all my worries, and I would be skeptical to believe an excuse like that. However, as cynical and mad as I am here, and I am mad, it'd be disingenuous of me to not recount my own experiences as a reviewer. Okay, editor's note here again, as I've already refilmed this segment 3 times, and another new thing came out. I was originally going to mention how Pimax never once pressured me to remove things for being negative or tried to change my mind on something, besides one incident where I was under NDA, but they immediately backed down once it was pointed out the info was public already, so I think that's
kind of fair. And I've also had other companies try to do exactly that, like DPVR, who was not happy with my review and requested I not make it public or rework it, but I refused. Or I've seen other companies do things like Play for Dream, apparently only sending units to people promising to be positive. Because there's a lot of examples like this in the industry on ethics and QC issues, with Pimax not being unique. But then a YouTube channel called GDXR posted a video covering a not great experience and made a YouTube post about it. While trying to get his issue resolved, Pimax actually asked him to take down the comment covering the bad experience so they could focus on inspection and resolution without external pressures, before his issue was even resolved. I'll be linking his video in the description. It has more back and forth exchanges beyond this one screenshot, so you can get the full context if you like. So now Pimax goes on the list, which makes everything else look worse, and the recent statement about wanting unbiased feedback ring oh so hollow when doing things like this. And I wonder if I just happen to work with one of the few people with either actual ethics or a brain to realize this is a terrible idea with somebody like me, without external pressures. Fuck off, Pimax.
It's frustrating to say all this because there have been obviously tangible, real attempts to change from Pimax, which shows they are listening to things, and there is the capacity to recognize screw-ups or no wrong was done. Again, I love seeing all the customer service and warranty improvements, but the effort of that is weakened by everything else. Pimax also asks for feedback all the time, and they even put out a video requesting it in light of the recent controversy. But while I do see those changes have happened, especially in the last several months, then I also see long-standing issues people have mentioned for years, which makes me feel like I am in a time loop having the same discussion over and over again. Really, it feels like Pimax is still sort of in that perpetual Kickstarter company phase, and they did start as one, but that doesn't really work all that well for established companies that have multiple factories. It leads to some cool stuff and getting to see things early, sure, but it also leads to all the headaches I've talked about, and the expectations and standards rightfully rise when in year 10 versus year 1. I said this 2 years ago, but I'm sad and disappointed. I again have to say I love the hardware, but still have a good number of problems with the company. I know so many people who are in the same place or would want to buy the hardware, but they don't because of the baggage surrounding the company. Pimax, you make exactly the kind of headset I want. I could not be in your target demographic more unless I was also a simmer. There's nobody else on the market I want to go to because I have some damn specific tastes. I hate lighthouses, which is what the high end is using, and pancake lenses, which the whole industry is shifting to. And you guys seriously do make great headsets if you can tolerate some tweaking. I want to see the companies succeed and do better, since I think Pimax targets some important areas often ignored. Seriously, who the hell is pushing high FOV and doesn't cost the price of a used car? But it's hard when things keep going like this, and it makes it so difficult to ever recommend the products except to a very specific type of person and with a bunch of asterisks. Could I have shunted the last several minutes off into its own video? Maybe, but I think it's really important people know what they're getting into with this company's history, since it directly affects the products and promises about them. I'd like to kind of keep this all in one place because more people are going to see this. I want this to be visible. I would love nothing more than to never have to do a segment like this again on Pimax product. Please don't mess up the dream airline so I can save 20-something minutes ranting. I don't like being the angry guy. On that dour note, we have the overall conclusions. This video is probably something like an hour long or more, so I'm gonna do my best to summarize. But concerning the 50 PPD in its normal FOV mode right now, which is what I have access to, I'm immensely enjoying mine. It provides incredible clarity and brightness, which many other headsets struggle to match, provided you can drive it at least. But it also provides some pretty great FOV well beyond most of the competition, especially on the vertical, where I think it is industry leading with a good face shape and people sleep on vertical. I have missed having FOV so much every damn day of my VR usage ever since switching from the 8KX to the Crystal, and now I finally have some of it back. But to truly unleash the full power of this headset and appreciate the Omega high clarity, you really need a 5090. I go as far to say 1.0 or high res as it's called in the software. It's kind of 5090 exclusive. But even at medium res, the headset is great and fairly sharp. But even for that, I think a 4070 Ti is kind of the minimum for a decent experience depending on your games. Like, if you want to have good FOV, this is the headset to get. There is almost nothing else on the market since the whole industry is kind of in the 110 to 100-ish range, or it costs way more for a similar but less FOV. But this headset has some real problems to work around. Like, even if the controller tracking is good, the Playspace memory in 4 is all over the place. OVR advanced settings or FPS VR are mandatory to fix your Playspace, but even those don't work in every game. And this means you gotta redo your room setup every few days at best, if not sooner. And then there's the bizarre experience ruining issues some people are getting when it comes to the colors and the local dimming, which, again, are not universal. Some people have had it literally appear and disappear for them. I can't speak how bad it is, as I'm not affected, but it sounds really bad from those who do have it. And visuals are kind of the whole thing in VR. The OG Crystal had a thing with the audio latency affecting some people, but you can work around that with headphones if you truly wanted. And the only workaround for this is to lower the brightness or contrast settings. I hear -1 to 3 seems to kind of help there, but it still doesn't sound like it's a very good solution. So yeah, it doesn't seem like there's that practical of a fix for it. And then there's the whole kind of everything with the company culture and behavior, with promised features taking a long time to arrive or having the fine details changed well after they are announced. Like the coming wide FOV software mode sounds like it's not really that great. So the solution to get more FOV that the 50 PPD was advertised as having is to get the $400 add-on because you decided to be an early adopter like an idiot. Pricing-wise, the Super is nice with its flexibility on Pimax Prime, though. I actually like the lump sum option, or 24 months of installments. It makes it viable for some people and can avoid certain types of taxes. They're not going to say that part out loud, though. Looking at around $1,700 to $1,800 USD total before any kind of applicable local taxes, which puts it in a similar price as a few high-end options, but you can actually make it comparable to cheaper than some if you don't have lighthouses yourself, since you need it for others like the Big Screen Beyond 2 or the Megane X. This is especially true if you are upgrading from the OG Crystal or have an old Pimax HMD. You can get up to $399 off by filling out a form. We'll have a link in the description. That makes the price very compelling if you ask me. But again, the SLAM tracking just has some problems to work with if you really want to use it. But do I recommend it at the end of the day? Well, setting aside the company antics on future features and only talking about the headset I have right here in this moment, I adore mine. Favorite headset by far. It is almost everything I want in an HMD, and the 5090 with this is just a match made in heaven, which makes so many games feel brand new with this high clarity and FOV. But to be perfectly honest, given the existence of stuff like the color bug, which seems like a minority, but still present enough, I do see regular complaints about it and how it's been so bad. I've seen some impacted prefer the original Crystal or return solely because of this. I am struggling to say yes, despite how much I love mine, because I can't guarantee you're going to have the same experience as me. That issue sounds truly experience ruining, and right now, there's no confirmed fix or workaround. Pimax has said it's about 80% fixed, to be fair. So there could be a fix coming soon. But they also said the 12K was 70% done many moons ago, and the audio latency on the OG Crystal never got fixed. Then there's everything else I already mentioned. So call me cynical, but I'd like to think it's best to wait until we have a confirmed solution before I can recommend it in good conscience to most people. Even though I'm loving mine, it hurts to say that. I will have a pinned comment if the color bug is fixed, and all this is nothing to worry about, by the way. There is one exception I would make for a very specific type of person, because I am that type of person. If you are somebody who is actively going to be involved in the community, regularly lurking discussion hubs like Discord for updates, and tracking the progress of fixes so you know exactly when you have any concerns that are addressed, and know that the Super is what you want since you crave that wider FOV without worrying much about form factor, there so you can know if it's safe to go ahead or refund once you get that address confirmation, I'd say you could think about it. Pre-orders are supposed to all be shipped by the end of June, while new orders you're looking at July or later, supposedly. So it could be like 2-3 months, maybe even more, till you get a unit, and a lot can change in that time. Pimax has made some key fixes in just the 1 month, namely the microphone on this, which was horrendous, and I was not expecting it to get fixed so soon. I still Caution about ordering right now, though, because of all the disclaimers I just made about future features. If you are not that type of person to do all those things, though, just don't buy it right now. Check the Pimax YouTube channel occasionally for updates to see if the stuff is fixed or not. They do release semi-regular updates that might help you decide and know when everything is good. And there is the video. If you made it to the end of this, seriously, thank you. I really appreciate those who take the time to watch me ramble for this long. It takes a bunch of time to record, gather all my sources, and edit this stuff. Exhausting things. So it means a lot to know people are actually watching this. As always, I do highly encourage you seek out other opinions and not making me your sole purchasing decision. Because VR is a very personalized thing, and my priorities in a headset may not be yours. I've already stated a few unpopular opinions here I'm sure someone is going to be angrily ranting at me for in the comments. I've tried to cover as much as possible too, but with how long this is and everything I had to go over, I may have forgotten a few small things. Leave any questions down in the comments and I will answer them as best as I can. If you like this content, consider sticking around subscribing to see what I do next. If not, thanks for watching, although you're probably not even at this part with how long this is. But if not, maybe I'll see you next in the recommendeds again sometime. Later.